Hello BookTube, my name is Elizabeth. Welcome back to my channel, Book as in Books. I have a tag for you today. It is the Reading Pet Peeves tag. It has a long history of a few weeks now. It started with a discussion video by Nick Stewart, and then Steve Donahue answered that video, and then a whole bunch of people answered that video, including MJ from Reading This Life, and then Allan from Big Hard Books and Classics turned it into a tag, and I was tagged. Thank you, Allan. So I will leave links in the description box below to a few of these videos, and I will now do the tag. And at the end of the tag, I will add a few pet peeves of mine that are not covered by Allan's prompts. So the first prompt is, do you use or read along with audiobooks? I tried audiobooks for the first time last year, and I've had more misses than hits. I cannot say that I enjoy audiobooks. As for reading with the audiobook, like having the written book in my hands and following with the audiobook, I tried it for one paragraph and it drove me bonkers. I did not like it. First, because I read faster than the audiobook. And if I speed up the audiobook, it still doesn't match the speed at which I'm reading because the pauses are still there. That's the thing. When I read in my head, there are no pauses. There's a period, but there's no pause between the sentence. But when you speed up the book, you speed up the words and the pauses remain. And anyway, it bugs me. So, and also there was the tone in my head and the tone of the audiobook was not the same. So it just drove me bonkers after paragraphs, and I stopped doing that, and I won't try it again because I'm pretty sure that's something I do not enjoy. But audiobooks, in and of itself, just listening to an audiobook from beginning to end, sometimes it works, very often it doesn't. The way that I use audiobook now is when I am reading a physical book, and then I have an audiobook available either from Scribd or from the library, and then I go for a walk and I will listen to a chapter or two while I'm outside walking. That's the only context in which I'm using audiobooks, and even then I cannot say that it works very well. It works for nonfiction. So far, it's the only thing that's worked for me is nonfiction. Fiction on audiobook doesn't really work, and it works if I'm not trying to judge the book too much. If I want to analyze the book, to ponder about the book, to read critically, basically. If I just don't want to be told its story. If I want to read critically, I have a very hard time with audiobooks. So I do use a little bit of them, but very, very little of them. I'm not a fan of audiobooks per se. Question 2, do you use your local library? Oh yes, I do. When I was younger, it was the only source of books for me. I went to the library every week, and during the summer, perhaps every day, maybe not, but I used to go to the library a lot. And then I kept on using the library all the way until I was, I'm going to say, a bit past 25, 20, 27, 28, something like that. In the first years I was living in Ottawa, I was living about 10 minutes away from my work. 10-minute walk away from my work, and between my apartment and my work there was the library, so I would stop at the library very, very often. And then I moved and I changed job, I don't remember in which order, and the library was not between where I lived and where I worked anymore, and I started to buy books a lot more. So I stopped using the library for a few years, and then the pandemic happened and I started using the library again. They had electronic books and I could borrow electronic books, and I basically rediscovered the library, and since then I've been at the library basically every week. It's not that I have a fixed time that I go to the library, but I borrow books, I bring back books, I put books on hold, and I have 1 week to go pick them up, and yeah, I use the library quite a bit. Question number 3, do you DNF books? I used not to DNF books. It used to be a pet peeve of mine that when I started a book, I had to finish it. However, one day I read a book. In English, the title is Reads Like a Novel by Danielle Pennac. And in there are the 10 rights of the reader. Jim from Jim's Books, Reading and Stuff did a video about them, and I will leave a link to it in the description box below. And right number 3 is the right to not finish a book. And to me, it came as a revelation. I don't have to finish a book. If I don't like it, I can stop. And it really changed the way I read, the way I read, because I really started to DNF books by the ton. And then at some point, I realized that it was not good for me. At some point, I think I was DNFing 2 books out of 3 that I started. And it was like I could not finish the book anymore unless it was ultra gripping story. And that meant there were plenty of books that I could not read anymore. And I did not like it. So I decided to stop DNFing books. But then again, what happened was that 3 years ago, I ended up being, I don't know how to say that in English, englué, sort of, like the book was a quagmire. I couldn't get out of it. I couldn't go through it. And then I realized that my stand on not DNFing, once again, was stupid. So now I sort of have compromised. I DNF books. I do DNF books, but I tried to make it a deliberate DNF. There are soft DNFs and hard DNFs. And the soft ones were the former, the sort when you sort of lose interest in a book, there's no particular reason to stop reading it except that the interest goes away, I start reading another book and then another one, and the first one just is forgotten. Sometimes I have to bring the book back to the library. It happens. But yeah, these soft DNFs, I try to avoid as much as possible. I try to go through a book. The hard DNFs, though, these ones are still completely acceptable. These are the ones when I'm reading a book and I'm saying, okay, you suck. Dear book, you suck. I'm going to stop you for whatever reason. It could be because it's poorly written, poorly researched, doesn't make sense. It's not what I was expecting, like not at all. I was expecting, let's say, some nonfiction. It turns out to be a fantasy book. It's unlikely that something as drastic as that will happen, but it happens, So any reason can be valid for a hard DNF, but I want my DNF to be intentional. So to answer the question, yes, I DNF books. Question number 4, do you read multiple books at the same time? I sort of answered that one. Yes, I do. I try not to read too many because, as I said, what happens is that the first one just goes out the window and I soft DNF the first one. I read 2 or 3 books at the same time. It's not so much, sometimes it is that I read a chapter of one and then a chapter of the other and then just go back and forth between a few pages of one and a few pages of the other. But more often what happens is that I start a book and then for some reason, I read something else in between. It could be because I have to read another book for the BookTube prize, because I have a buddy read scheduled, because the book is long and I need something else in between because 800 consecutive pages of the same thing is just too much. So basically, I read books in between other books. So I tend to have 2 or 3 books on the go. But not much more than that, because more than that, it will end up in too many DNFs. Question number 5. Do you make time or have a specific time in your day devoted to reading? It's not so much that I make time, but the time is there. And when I have time, I read. At the moment, reading is my only hobby. I used to play a bit of music. I don't anymore. I used to attend concerts. And since the beginning of the pandemic, I have not attended a single concert. So basically, I have no other hobby except reading. So when I'm finished working, I start to read and I read until I go to bed, basically. So it's not that this time is reserved for it. It's just that that's how I want to use my time. Question number 6. Do you dog ear books? No, it hurts the book. Don't hurt the book. Question number 7. Do you annotate your books? Yes, and it's not a contradiction with what I've just said. Writing in a book doesn't hurt the book, depending on how you write in it. I use pencil. I don't use pen. I don't use markers. I don't deface my books. However, I do write in them in pencil. I underline. That's the main type of mark that there are in my books. It's underlining. And I write some comments in the margins, but not a lot. It's not a dissertation. And if I realize that I have a lot to say, I will use a post-it. And I will put the post-it in the middle of the page or at the side of the page. And I use little flags too, to the places where I am interested, where I put a little mark or something. So basically it's more in post-it style. So everything is removable. So either you remove the post-its or you erase whatever I wrote, but the book itself will not be defaced. It can be used by someone else. It can be enjoyed, not quite as a new book, but almost by another person. So I don't impose my reading to someone else. If they want to get rid of it, they can. So yeah, I do annotate my books, but I don't deface them. Question number 8, how do you feel about spoilers? Well, like everyone, I don't like to be told in a murder mystery, that's the guilty one. I don't want to know that, but that's kind of specific to mysteries. In mysteries, I want to know as little as possible. For some other things, I don't mind the spoilers. Even I enjoy the spoilers, and sometimes I go for the spoilers. A couple of weeks ago, I went to see a Shakespeare play that I had never read and that I had never seen, and I didn't know what it was about. It was All Is Well That Ends Well. And I read a summary of the play that told me what everyone does and how everyone ends, and basically every plot point all the way to the end, because I wanted to know what was going on. For me, Shakespeare is complicated. The language of the 16th, 17th century is difficult for me. There are a lot of characters in Shakespeare, and sometimes knowing who is whom is difficult. So if I know what they do when I see them on the stage, I will be much more able to recognize them. And it's going to make the play much more enjoyable for me if I know where it's going. So in that case, I will spoil myself. I will want to know what's going on. In some other cases, ancient literature, epic poetry like the Iliad and the Odyssey, I will read the introduction because I want to know what's going on. I want to know the characters. I want to know what are the themes. I want to be able to pay attention to the content of the book without having to try to figure out what's going on, because it's not always clear what is going on in ancient literature. Some of the books I start even though for some reason they were spoiled for me. There was one Agatha Christie that I knew who did it, but I wanted to read it anyway. That was The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. I read it anyway because I wanted to read it. Another book that I started reading knowing basically how it ended. I won't say the name of the book, but I'm going to tell you the spoiler. There's a sentence at the end that says, "Reader, I married him." So I knew that the narrator would marry the man in question. But I didn't know how. I didn't know how it got there. I didn't know anything in between. It's the period in between that is interesting. That is the evolution of the characters, the evolution of the relationship. So I did not care that I knew that the narrator would marry the man in question. I think it didn't change anything. It didn't necessarily make the book better, but it certainly did not make it worse. So in that case, I don't care for spoilers. And in my videos, I try to avoid them. For me, a spoiler is anything that is beyond the first 25% of the book, I think, somewhat. I cannot say that I'm calculating this scientifically, but it's pretty much that. The first 25% of the book, I consider it as the presentation, the premise. It's not necessarily a spoiler. However, sometimes a spoiler may happen just at the 10th page, let's say, or something like that. But I try to avoid spoilers, but sometimes I can't, and then it tends to be rather spontaneous. It's not planned, and then I'm going to say, "Oh, spoiler alert, I'm going to tell you who did it. It's him." And then I blurt it out. Because I can't help it sometimes, because sometimes it's hard to give an opinion without saying, well, the ending bothered me. And you can't really explain why it bothered you if you cannot say what the ending is. So I'm going to mention it. So I'm not going to assume that everybody knows that all my videos have spoilers in them. I will mention it, spoiler alert, and then the viewer has like 1 second to stop the video because I can't help myself, and I will just blurt everything out. So that was the last question by Allan, but I have a couple of extra pet peeves that are not covered in there. So the first one is about the order in which I read books. In his original video, Nick Stewart talked about the fact that when he started reading a series, he had to finish it. I don't have that problem. I start series. I don't even start them at the beginning. Sometimes I start in the middle, and if the author is not good enough to make sure that I can start in the middle, then too bad for him or her. I'm just not going to read the rest of the series. So that is not a thing. But however, one thing that is a pet peeve of mine, I will not read the same author twice in a row. So I will not read back-to-back books by the same author, because the second one is never as good as the first one. And worse if there's a third one. I used to do that. It used not to bother me, particularly in series. I started a series, I read a book, and then the other, and I wanted to finish it. But then at some point I realized that I was starting to see things that I was not supposed to see. I started to see the structure of the book. I started to see the tics of the writing tics of the author. I started to see the formula in the book, and it's very often it's just not as enjoyable. I don't want to see that. I'm going to give an example. It was Ken Follett, The Pillars of the Earth, and then the second one in that series, it is I forgot the title. But basically, when you read the second one, you realize that it's a formula. You have the underdog, you have the young lady, independent young lady who wants a life for herself and doesn't want to get married or wants to choose her husband. You have the two brothers, the one that is weak but smart and the one that's big but stupid but strong. And you have all of these characters that sort of are formula characters, and the arc of the book is pretty much the same. And yeah, so that's the reason why I don't want to read books back to back, because I have not read another Ken Follett since, because I know I will find the same characters and I will find the same formula in another book, and that's no fun. So yeah, I'm not reading two authors back to back, and more I try to avoid reading the same genre back to back. In June, I read 2 historical romances back to back, and the second was not as good as the first one. It could be because the second was not as good as the first one, but it was also, I think, because I had historical romance fatigue. I had my fix of historical romance after the first half of the second book. I needed basically 1.5 books to get my fix, and then the second half of the second book was just too much. So yeah, I realize more and more that I need variety in my book diet. I need to change book. From book to book, I need to change type of book. So I need a lot of variety. I need to mix things up. And my second pet peeve that is not covered by Allan's prompt and probably would not be applicable to most of you, it has to do with the languages in which I read books. Now, as the name of my channel says, I read books in French, that's bouquet, and I read books in English, that's books. And there are some books I will not read in English. Those are the books that were originally written in French. There's of course the reason that we lose something in translation, but there's also the reason that I read so much faster in French. It would be a waste of time for me to read any book that was originally written in French to read it in English. In some cases, it has to do with language, because I want to read the original as much as possible. So a book that was originally written in English, I will read in English. Particularly if it's poetry or a novel or a piece of fiction. When it comes to nonfiction, I'm not as much of a stickler to that rule. I will read in French some books that were written in English. When it comes to genre fiction, I will read in French books that were written in English, but not the other way around, because that's a question of time. It's not a question of quality, it's a question of time. Some language combinations I will not do. I will not read in English a book that was originally written in Italian, in Spanish, in Portuguese, or any other Latin language, because I know that I will lose too much of the language. I think that, obviously, it's scientific. French is closer to Spanish and Italian and Portuguese than English is. So if I want to be closer to the original, I need to read it in French, because I don't have the ability to read in Spanish, in Italian, or in Portuguese. By the same token, chances are that for a work of fiction, if it was originally written in Dutch or in German, I perhaps will enjoy it more if it's the English translation rather than the French translation. But it depends very much. For genre fiction, I don't think it applies. For nonfiction, it doesn't always apply. It rarely applies. Well, anyway, that's rarely translated nonfiction. It applies really for literary fiction, poetry, and theater, but I read very little of that. So it's really for literary fiction. I will pay attention to the language combination much more than for other genres of books. So yeah, that's the other pet peeve of mine that was not covered. Yeah. And I think that's it for my pet peeves, reading pet peeves. If I think of another one, I'll make another video, I guess, because these discussions are always very interesting. Now, there's no prompt for tagging people, but I'm going to tag people anyway. So I'm going to tag people that were not tagged by Allan and that I don't think have made a video, at least not as I am filming this. So I'm going to tag Gina Steiner, Berna's Bookish Adventures, Nikki at Red Dot Reads, and David Wiley. Now, of course, as always, it's just an invitation, not an obligation. Feel no pressure at all. It's just that I'm curious about your reading pet peeves. And thank you everyone for watching. I will see you in the next video. À la prochaine!